Thank you, Emily. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us at Venture Cafe for the first virtual artist studio tour of the year. Tonight, I'm very excited to present the work of Philadelphia-based glass and sculpture artist, James Labold. James's work uses contemporary and historical imagery to create imagined narratives that reflect on the connection between our past and present culture. James gets his inspiration from found objects and mass-produced items, as well as classical sculpture. His love of history, mythology, and philosophy drive his work into how our culture is defined with images. So James received his BFA from Temple University and his MFA from Ball State University in Indiana, both in glass. He's exhibited his work extensively throughout the United States and has received numerous prestigious awards, such as the Glass Art Society's Sachs Emerging Artist Award and the Rome and Haas Fine Art Achievement Award. So now I'd like to go ahead and welcome our guest, James Labold. Hey, James.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Of
Went
course,
for a
thanks for coming.
deep cut with that Roman Haas Fine Art Achievement Award. It was a long time ago. I don't know if Roman Haas is even a company anymore. But that was a good, thanks for having me.
Of course.
So I have coming live from my luxurious basement, which used to be a primary studio for me in some regards, and after COVID became a primary studio again for some new stuff. So I have a presentation of some of my work that I can give a little more insight to and show some examples and sort of a little bit about my influences in the past, where sort of my ideas came from, some of my processes. And towards the end, I'll get a little bit into what's going on behind me in the new basement studio. So should I go ahead and share a screen, or? All right, I'm gonna share a screen. I might need a little
Emily, I think he needs co-host status. Sorry.
Yeah.
I think he's got it. Oh, no, when he came back, he lost it. I'm so
sorry.
Sorry about that. You're now a co-host.
Okay, so I will share a screen. Here we go. Just put this in.
Looks good.
Thanks. So before I dive too into this, I guess I do want to again thank you Venture Cafe for having me. Thanks Angela. You know, my wife and I were talking about how we met, and it's just very cool. You know, it was Comics Jam a million years ago
That's right.
we met, you know,
10 years ago, or probably more than that now.
I think it's I think it's more than 10. But you know, that's just one of the things I love about this city and the art community here. And you know, it's good to see people continuing to pursue their passions, and it's great that this has come out of that. So but yeah, I kind of hadn't thought about Comics Jam in a while. Oh, yeah.
To everyone else, it was like a group where we met once a month and drew comics.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sort of like a Exquisite Corpse kind of situation, but with comic strips.
Yeah.
So, you know, many different creative pursuits. Anyhow, and it was a weird bunch who are mostly still weird from what I've kept up with. So,
for sure.
Anyhow, so as Angela said, I have a BFA in glass from Tyler School of Art, Temple University. I grew up in the area. I grew up in Bucks County, and my whole family is in sort of Philadelphia for as long as there was Labolds around the United States. So, you know, I guess I have personal and family history here to some regards. I left for a while, lived in Arizona for a while, came back to Philadelphia. Because the dry heat wasn't for me, and worked in mixed media, glass, some screen printing for a while, even. Then ended up going to graduate school quite a while after I'd been out of undergrad, 10 years actually. So I actually appreciated graduate school and all those resources quite a bit. And after a little more bopping around, I came back. So without further ado, I'll get into the real deal here. So over the last 6 years, I've done a lot of these sort of visiting artist presentation, and I will talk a little bit about how my work has, my process has been influenced or sort of utilized at a traveling artist kind of idea. So usually I'm giving this presentation to people that aren't from Philadelphia. So these first few slides will be redundant for those of you that are locals. But obviously typically I introduce this like, I'm from Philadelphia. It was founded by William Penn, etc. Here's the city hall. Home, birthplace of democracy, as we like to call, Independence Hall. And, obviously we all know, or anyone that's based out of Philadelphia and lived here long enough knows we're, swimming in the colonial and Revolutionary War era history. For me, I had more than enough field trips to all these sites and even family vacations to these Revolutionary War sites. And these sort of like ideas of the ideals, I guess, of the founding of this nation were really ingrained in my education, and what later I reflect on as sort of like a mythical or even like sort of a civil religious way, if you want to look at it like that. But on the other hand, we're, famous for greasy sandwiches, extravagant dressing, debatably, we don't have to get into the politics. We'll get there later. And, notoriously, famous for this Underdog movie, and which has a sculpture right next to one of the greatest museums, I think, in the world. I spent a lot of time going here as a child and influenced me early as an artist. I do think works of like Marcel Duchamp, this sort of idea, the ready-made and found object, came to influence me a lot over the years. Although my earliest inspiration to even explore sculpture came from the Rodin Museum. And, for those of you who don't know, the Rodin Museum in Philadelphia is the largest collection of Rodin's work outside of Paris. But really, I grew up in Newtown, which is in Bucks County, which is the first town founded after Philadelphia. And I guess like William Penn just ran out of inspiration after naming Philadelphia, and the new town was named Newtown. But short drive out of the city, home of Edward Hicks, who is more known for Peaceable Kingdom. So some of my early work was, I started out as a printmaker. I got interested in sculpture. I got interested in glass because it is this very immediate, reactive medium that it's very quick. You don't have a lot of time to work with it. It's hot. It's very intense, but short-lived. And I started making these sort of almost, I would say, like sort of reimagined contemporary shrines. So early on, I was always using glass and mixed media. Always a lot of found objects that were sort of supplementing. Initially, to be honest, supplementing my sculpting abilities. I couldn't sculpt everything I wanted to, but I could often find it at the thrift store. One of the things about glass that is less convenient is it's very expensive. It's not so convenient when you're not a student, when you're not working for a university. There are public access studios, but shop rental time is expensive. And when I found myself outside of school, I sort of just honed in on using the found objects themselves and continuing with this sort of shrines in a consumer, sort of an imagined consumer culture cult, if you will. Occasionally I would get access to glass and reincorporate sculpted elements. This was a self-portrait at some point. It's pretty old, so the digital quality is not great, but that is a horse from behind at the center.
Just real quick, can you tell us like why it's so hard to, like why glass is so expensive to make?
Essentially, like any like hot glass is run out of like a furnace that is typically running 24 hours a day. So if a studio is like a private production studio, you know, for them, they really have to be, you know, making their product profitable to keep their keep the gas on. The private or sort of public access studios that you can rent time at typically start around $30 an hour for like a very small amount of access. So it sort of becomes quickly limiting to like, if you want to experiment, do you have, you know, $200 to mess around for a day? And then it sort of starts to feel like, well, if I'm going to rent time in the studio, I have to make something that I know I'm going to sell. So I should make some Christmas ornaments and vases, you know, and I've made my share of Christmas ornaments and vases, and there's nothing wrong with making things to get by. But, you know, if you're sort of working in a studio, often you'll have some sort of access as a perk. But typically, if you're not attached to them and you're just renting it, you know, it's purely the gas bills. I mean, or electric. There are shops that are running electric furnaces, but again, it's a lot of electricity that's running all day long. So it can quickly become cost prohibitive. And especially, you know, I worked at a glass studio when I was in Arizona and had Friday nights to experiment, and that was very generous of the shop owner, you know. But it was also usually Friday night after a full week of work, and, you know, inspired or not, sometimes you just don't physically have a lot of energy to get out at that point, you know. You've already worked your 40 plus hours, so getting your masterpiece done is like, you know, maybe not going to happen before dinner. But yeah, so that's a little bit of why it's kind of costly. It's not so much the glass, it's everything that goes into making it molten. So so in terms of this sort of like this idea of a civil religion or a sort of national mythology, you know, I've always been interested in how we being like the United States, have incorporated a lot of neoclassical architecture, imagery, and sort of co-opted sort of Roman and Greek, both the ideals and the imagery and the icons of that. So this is the Capitol Dome in Washington, D.C., and this is the apotheosis of Washington. So for those of you that aren't really familiar with this sort of mythological jargon, the apotheosis is like the sort of ascending to heaven. And every one of these figures is an allegorical figure representing some, you know, liberty, revolution, you know, oceans, land, you know. It sort of goes, to me, almost counter to this idea of a democracy, in that it's like turning our founders. I mean, immediately, George Washington, the first one, we turn him into a godlike figure. Our sort of, you know, symbols of our government are modeled on these historical temples. There's a sort of, you know, implication that the Supreme Court is a temple. I mean, it's directly based on the Parthenon. And to some extent, that was like a very conscious decision to incorporate these sort of classical forms to allude to the Greco-Roman sort of traditions of democracy and republicanism. And on the other hand, I've always been interested in just symbols in general, what they mean and how they change over time. So now most of us, you know, in recent years, are this sort of all-seeing eye, and the pyramid has become more closely associated with conspiracy theories, Illuminati and whatnot, whatever we're onto now in conspiracy theory world. But you know, its origin goes back to Freemasonry, this idea of like a benevolent or like omnipotent benevolent force that's watching over us. but that eye, that use of the eye, is like directly connects back to the Eye of Horus in Egypt, which still held that idea of like a deity watching over and protecting you. So now to some actual artwork that I made. So this interest in like the neoclassical, the classical, and it being reinterpreted for contemporary purposes, or in not so contemporary, but sort of national purposes or national myth making, has inspired me a lot. As I said, this is just some early work, early as in a few years ago, but older work. This idea of like a facade being a sort of, a term we use both as like a physical architectural detail, but also something we use to imply like a false front in a way. These are some glass pieces. They are using this hot blow mold process, which is a lost wax process. I'll talk a little bit more about the details of the process later. In the US Capitol, there's where they would have, the capitals of columns, as opposed to being like a traditional Roman form, they actually, instead of having acanthus leaves and sort of the traditional things you see on, many columns, but a traditional Roman or Greek column, they actually incorporated corn and tobacco leaves to make them more like an American version of the classical capital. So I took these and sort of built these off just a basic form, but made molds and assembled these forms in wax, then transferred them into glass. So this is another sort of extent of this idea of like the national myth making, divisive ruling, in thinking about the Supreme Court and thinking about this sort of body that's sort of the final body of all, legal rulings in the US, is composed of 9 people with differing opinions and differing perspectives. The female figure I actually found, I found a rubber mold in the trash, which was like a mega trash find for me because I didn't have to make a mold of anything. I already found the mold. But then I manipulated that figure by adding, the traditional like blind justice attributes, some neoclassical architectural details at the bottom, and a little difficult to see from a form, but it is actually assembled. It was made in 9 sections, and there's like 9 distinct sections of it. Not that like any of it necessarily correlates, but when I made this, it was a more evenly divided court than it is now, which is why it's half red and half blue. So in my time in graduate school, I also sort of started exploring neon and had access to that. It's another thing that like I think plays with the low culture and the pop culture side of things that I'm engaged in. But I tried to sort of incorporate that into using some of the same imagery. He has looked favorably upon our undertakings is like a loose translation of what's on the back of the Great Seal on every dollar bill. It's a new order of the ages, and he has looked favorably upon our undertakings. These are a bunch of hands, and then, sorry, I don't have a great detail shot of this. All the hands are actually a set of praying hands that I divided in half and made into just hands reaching out. There's like objects from Space Race, and then like Elvis and pop culture, both like high and low. Again, this little like, beefcake guy is a big favorite of mine. He's a cake topper. So I am also very interested in how these kitsch objects are made, or like decisions like, I don't know the decisions I made and so went into making them. But at one point in time, I was able to access a bunch of slip cast molds. So molds for making ceramic pieces. And these were old production molds that I could repurpose to form wax sculptures and then form glass castings out of. And most of them seem to be from the 60s, maybe the 70s at the latest, but I have an auction junkie friend who called me up and said, I got a building full of molds, come take your pick. Luckily I found this astronaut, and I thought, yeah, this like it was clearly made during the early days of the space race. There was sort of this like confident, almost arrogant, like just something that like a sort of, I made this, this was like second Obama era. There was already a lot of the divisiveness that's going on now that was becoming part of national politics. And I felt like that like national pride and unity that like came out of space race era, like that was showing through in this cheesy object, maybe didn't so much exist anymore. But this was also at the time where they had stopped using the space shuttle, or they just announced it, or it was like happening. So it was this idea that like our space race had kind of petered out, and fast forward a few years and we got SpaceX and all that stuff. But so I reinterpret this as an Icarus form. The wings are actually from like another one of the slip cast molds, as is the base. So, I mentioned a little bit, and Angela mentioned a little bit, sort of influence of classical sculpture and classical architecture. But I'm as much influenced by contemporary work, obviously political work, and modernism. And at first glance, this is probably a pile of Abe Lincoln heads, like does not scream modernism or classical anything. But I had both this Abraham Lincoln bust and this John F. Kennedy bust. And I think, as sort of historical anomalies of being assassinated, there's all these like Lincoln was shot in the Ford Theater, Kennedy was shot in a Ford Lincoln town car, I think those are like, it's a little conspiracy theory-ish, but just by chance, I have these two heads. One was made out of a plaster cast mold, other was slip cast. JFK actually seems to be like a little less attractive in bust form, and Lincoln seems to be a little better looking, a little bit maybe connected to the processes that they were made in. But they both sort of, to me, bookend this like you could look at both their assassinations as being connected to like the civil movements that were going on at the time, the Civil War and the Civil Rights Movement, and that like the Civil Rights Movement was a natural extension of like what theoretically should have been resolved right by the end of the Civil War, or at the Civil War. But 100 years later, a president is like assassinated, and motives aside, like I think it can draw a connection between those two, and also that it is sort of shocking that took 100 years, and now we're another 60 years on and still reckoning with some of these issues. The form was there's another one. Okay, I gotta jump back. The form of these was inspired by Constantine Brancusi's endless column, which this is a smaller version of it. Brancusi made lots of iterations of this form, but the largest one is a monument to war heroes or war dead in Hungary, I believe. I might be speaking there. So this is sort of like me like riffing on both like modernism, some classical sort of sculpture or traditional sculpture that's been filtered through kitsch. This, again, I was making a lot of towers. This is around from the same time, so 2015-ish. My thoughts was this was an Avon perfume bottle that was in the shape of the U.S. Capitol building. It's like a weird, like, is that like a way to like respect the like you're really into the Senate and Congress, so you want an Avon bottle? I don't know. It's very like kitschy, just cheesy, and I don't think people think a lot about it. But I get really interested in like, what do these objects mean? Like, what I thought, like, is this a coded message from Avon that Congress stinks? So I molded the original bottle and then repeated it over and over again to kind of create this form of like the Capitol building sort of crumbling under its own weight, under its own bureaucracy. you know, things were like seemed, I don't know, that was like when they were holding up Merrick Garland's nomination back then. I don't know, like a simpler time when yeah, we'll get there. So I also like take some of these objects, especially the neon, and work them into installation. So I have independent sort of sculptures that operate on their own as just pedestal or whatever. But I do still really love like bringing found objects and fabricated objects, collaging them together. All of this is like, for me, assemblage or three-dimensional collage is a way of, filtering all these images like through my brain, spewing them back out in this sort of like visualized process of me trying to reconcile the ideals that we're supposed to be founded on, the sort of like hyper consumer culture that we're a part of, the sort of fanaticism that goes along with all of that. So, again, this was like a lot of congressional bickering, and there was always this: we have to compromise, we have to reach across the aisle, and then getting nowhere. And this is my like tongue-in-cheek little take on that. But the Pegasus, on one hand, this is a rocking horse. This is a toy, like beat up pony, but transformed into a Pegasus, but bringing some sort of imagined myth to that. Again, in like the installation realm, the myth is real. This was like several vignettes that predominantly were, found objects in neon with glass elements. I sort of viewed it as like a whole installation, but also as sort of smaller subsections. So monumental failure, this is like a 12 or 13 foot tall sort of obelisk, meant to look like it's both under construction or sort of crumbling. Like the plaster is chippy, it's made out of like low budget materials. The neon all works, but it's sort of jumbled, like it got dropped. But there's still this like illuminating eye at the top. At the very, very top is a security mirror, so like the viewer can see themselves like directly being watched by the eye. And then in the other corner is eye in the sky. These planes are actually silhouettes based on the pattern of a Predator drone, and pretty accurately. That was like there was a lot of Predator drone things going on at that point in time. Simpler times, I guess. But this is the sort of idea of like a eye watching over us could also be reinterpreted as a surveillance state. Is the eye benevolent or not so benevolent? This was actually an existing column in the gallery that was oddly in the middle of the gallery. So my solution was like, it was really messing with the flow of my mental version of this installation. So I just had to make it part of it. So there's these rotating sort of spiral of shelves and all across. Yeah. So there's all these little like vignettes of found objects. Some of them are like fully assembled, like could be taken off as individual sculptures. Some of them are just arrangements. So this is cheerleaders from a trophy, praying hands holding a predator drone model. And then it's all surrounded with LEDs and neons, sort of give this like mystical electric appearance. And at the time, this is the silent majority crashes FDR's party. This was more about like this idea of like FDR's 4 pillars of freedom, for freedom speech, which was like this big foundational idea of just like, I'm not gonna get too into them, but that this sort of long view of the dismantling of all these social programs. I don't think I realized like there would be actual party crashing the day before this talk. But man,
I was gonna say this is like so relevant.
Yeah, like I'm really like timing wise,
yeah.
I think I made a lot of this stuff, and it was like the Obama era, and people were like, what are you all like worked up about, or why are you making this work? And to me, I was like, well, I'm looking at like the infighting and the narrative, and like, where does this go? And I certainly did not foresee the last 4 years, but You know, I wish it stayed more like imaginary, but it did make some cool sculpture. I like, you know, I like the work out of it. I feel like it hits harder for me now than it did when I made it. And you know, I don't think I could have imagined that like actually happening. This was all this sort of imagined dystopian narrative with neon illuminating it. So there's like a couple of snakes in the back twisting together, fighting together. These clouds are all neon and insulation foam. There's like 4 full columns, although one is like almost non-existent because it's in shards. Well, that got in there twice. So at some points I do incorporate both the neon and blown glass like a little more closely. This is actually made with some like black light, neon tubing, and sensitive glass that illuminates under that. And this is just sort of like another iteration of this, like repeating the figure and repeating a pattern or repeating a figure. To me, I think when you look at history, like what I was taught as history, what we all have been taught, it changes like over time. Like history has this malleable nature. You know, they always say like it's written by the victors, but it's not just written by like the victors of a certain incident. Like history is, you know, part of our like cultural narrative, and that shifts with time. You know, Lincoln is now sort of this you know, sort of icon, you know, almost like untouchable presidential figure, but I mean arguably pretty divisive like in his day. You know, I think obviously I think he was on the right side of history in the end, but even getting there was a little messy. But we don't like to get into the messy details of history. So for me, like repeating these figures, manipulating the forms sort of like plays off of that a little bit. Now we're getting a little more contemporary. So this is the same form. This is when there was a lot of talk about draining swamps, and you know, I was thinking of it more of a puddle, but you know, I'd like play on words, so capitalize or capitalizing. I think the capitalizing on this whole narrative worked out for someone. So before I get too much into more of the current stuff, I just want to talk a little bit about my processes that I've showed you. Most of the work I've showed you is used. They're lost wax form. They start as wax positives. I use a lot of found objects that I make rubber molds out of. And you can see some bits and pieces laying around here. I then take those different forms of waxes and collage them together. So this is that same JFK head I used before. I was teaching a workshop in like Bavaria, Germany. So there's this like famous JFK mispronunciation where he said "Ich bin ein Berliner," meaning to say like I'm a Berliner or we're all Berliners, and he said I'm a donut in translation. So all the Germans like knew this joke way more than I had like just learned it before I went there, just doing a little research. But so there is a donut on the back of him. And a lot of these were objects that I found while I was there that I was able to make molds of. And on the right is the final glass form. So that is a very bad cell phone picture, but the original piece is somewhere in Germany still, or maybe Belgium. But here's 2 others like in process shots where you can see the wax form, how it's all collaged together. And then in the end, once I have that wax, I make a mold of it. So this is a wax form inside of a mold, melt the wax out, take the mold into a glass studio, heat that mold up, pull it out. These are some students at a workshop I taught in Wisconsin. And what they're doing is blowing glass into a bubble, in a glass bubble into the mold. A lot of people use this process for casting. And then now there's like myself and a handful of people that are working regularly with this process, but actually blowing glass into these forms. Here's me with a bigger one. It's a lot of standing around waiting for things to cool off. So it's usually a good time to, you know, take some goofy photos up there. But so the form has to sort of be something that a bubble can easily travel to, but it will get this high level of detail like any casting would. The difference between like the casting glass and blowing is temperature wise. You could cast glass at 2000 degrees or anywhere between 1500 and 2000, spend a lot of time in an oven that has a lot of time to travel into all kinds of nooks and crannies. This is a very fast process. Once the mold is up, it's like 15 minutes of me blowing glass into it. But it gets all the detail, all the surface detail. So for example, this piece is cut into sections, but it's just 2 views of the same wax piece. And this is the final piece in glass. And I make it out of clear glass usually and use a variety of pigments and mixed medias to finish them. You know, I like the idea of like using the translucency and transparency. Some things like being more transparent than others, I think piggybacks a little bit on my ideas about history and how we view ourselves. This is actually one that I was in that picture blowing the mold of. So this came a little later, like after I returned to Philly. After I finished in Indiana, I taught out there for a year, and then I moved on to doing some residencies. I came back to Philly after like 3.5 years, or close to 4, I guess, not 3.5. And I didn't have a studio. I didn't have anything. I could do my little wax assemblages in a basement, and I was able to get a couple of these opportunities lined up where I would go as a visiting artist and basically show up with a bunch of waxes and maybe molds and, you know, do a lecture not unlike this, but also do demonstrations for students and in exchange get like some gas money and get to make my sculptures. So this was all modeled, molded, all that work was done in Philadelphia. I took it with me with a bunch of other stuff to Detroit, to College for Creative Studies out there, did a week-long thing, hung out with the students, had a great time, brought it back to Philadelphia, finished it, did all my sort of top coat painting, whatnot. And then weirdly enough, sent it back to Detroit to a gallery like a year later. But this is playing off this. This is really when I was we were in the midst of, you know, right after Parkland, and there was like this really amazing, powerful movement of like all these youth. It was like, I felt like the first, I don't know, it was a very sad thing to be motivating people, but it was like a very inspiring to see these like youth really motivating about gun control and like the response from youth about gun violence like all across the country. So in like a rare like hopeful moment from James Labold, this was sort of my like vision of like, you know, the end of that wisdom of like guns, and because, you know, I think there's valid arguments for self-defense and whatnot, but I think a lot is driven by like factor profits, you know, by keeping things sold. So there's sort of cherubs like busting up pistols and guns. On the other hand, like I always have to have the sort of alternate view of things worked into this. So the owl, while it is on one hand a symbol of wisdom that most of us know it as, you know, it also is a harbinger of death in many cultures. So I like that sort of duality of that image. This is a sort of piggybacking on some of the earlier work you saw, but actually putting Kennedy and Lincoln together again. So again, these are from the same original wax molds and the same heads that I've just like made over, reworked, manipulated. This is a little larger. It's truncated column from the Invisible Hand. Like again, playing with the sort of neoclassical reinterpretation of things. I'm going to speed up because I realize I've been going on for a long time on this presentation. I'm sorry. This is like more current. This is actually a couple of years ago, and I want to get this one in there and say, you know, if you're not familiar with Goya's, you know, Francisco Goya, 200 years ago almost, or maybe, did this disasters of war and Los Caprichos, and there's this famous image that's the title. It's in Spanish, but the title is "The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters." And I feel like the evidence of sleep of reason is very just showed its head yesterday. And then this is again from 2 years ago almost that I made this, but this Den of Snakes is another blown glass piece. But I think I guess I saw that coming. This is again another piggybacking on the same idea of like the ruinous nature of gun violence and sort of the debate around it, but there's sort of this like hopeful youth, which is a knockoff Michelangelo's David at the top. 2020, I'm gonna like zoom through this because I want to get times for questions and all that. Obviously my practice was based on traveling. Like I would make waxes in my basement, and then I would go wherever I could make glass and teach a workshop and bring the stuff home. And then I had a swing going. I had some residencies lined up this year and some shows lined up. COVID hit, obviously. I was afraid to even go. I finally got a studio outside of my house, and I was afraid to even go there, for a while until I cracked. But in that time, I just decided to like get a 3D printer because I could do that in my basement. And Cliff Notes version is like 6 years ago, someone who I assisted at a residency was like, you should get into 3D, like you should get into 3D printing. You can down, like if you love found objects, you could just print like all these objects. So there's this initiative called Scan the World, which many museums around the world are taking part of, where they're offering free 3D scans of their collections. And this is just a screenshot of it, but you can like Google them. It's super cool. Even if you're not into printing, it's very interesting to like open these files and inspect masterpieces like way closer than you ever would get to, right? But I'm taking their files, which this is like, they encourage remixing, reusing, many of them have completely like public domain free licensing. I take it in this mesh mixer program to edit it, manipulate it there. So I'm sort of translating what I was doing with wax, but like digitally, which took a lot to learn that. Then I print it out. Then I make a rubber mold of it. I don't have a picture of the mold, but these are plaster castings from that mold. So I can make like small additions of these pieces. Ultimately, they'll like be translated into glass, plaster, resin, like many other things. But the last 4 months, I've really just been like playing on my computer in my basement with these prints. So that went, I'm sorry, longer than.
Oh, that was great. I loved it.
But that last piece, just I wanted to show this because I am like really stoked about the 3D printing, but the events of the last few days have made me feel like I should have focused on the older work a little. But that last screenshot was, so this is like the top part of it, that piece. I ran out of that color, so this is the middle. And then I still have to print the third part, but if it was running, you guys wouldn't be able to hear me. And then assemble them and mold make. So that, yeah, I'll take some questions if there's some questions.
Well, I just have a quick question for you. So, all of your work seems to be influenced by history and politics in some way. How has 2020 kind of influenced your subject matter or what you're thinking about making in the future?
Yeah. I know I kind of like glanced over it pretty quickly, but my processes are slow, like really slow. And then I added 3D printing, which like that print took like 5 days total for the 2 parts, and I think that's good for me because it gives me a lot of time to reflect on things like before I actually put that piece out into the world, and that they don't get to be just a political cartoon. Because obviously, like anyone, I'm reacting like very immediately to what's happening. And want to create things, but for me, it's like I want to jot some things down or doodle some ideas. And, I do try to focus a little bit like on that historical view and the bigger, like sort of meta narratives of our like national culture and like how that ties into global culture too. I don't want it to be that I'm purely US centric, but this is where I live. And I think like this is the culture that I'm going to reflect back in the work I make. And the reflections have not been particularly like pretty in the last couple of years. I think all that 2020 like isolation time, between COVID, all like the Black Lives Matter protests over the summer, the like what all this stuff in the last couple of days, all these sort of rising sort of uh conspiracy theory people coming out of the woodwork. It's so much to respond to. And um I haven't made anything that's like 100% new and done in response. Like I feel like I've started these bits and pieces, um, but for me, it's like a little easier in a way to start responding to it, like in a historical view or with some old things, and like work my way up to the present. Like it took me a long time to make like those the two gun violence connected pieces. Like that took me like a full year after Parkland to even have those like ready to really display, because I want to be like thoughtful about it. I want to be timely about it, and just considerate about contemporary issues, and especially sometimes when the landscape's changing like so rapidly. Are you going to make a sculpture about like some event that no one remembered 2 days later? I mean, I think some events we know will be going down in history from the last 48 hours, but yeah, I'm trying to take my time. There's a lot to take in from
It takes a lot to process things too. So
yeah.
I like James. My name's Margarita, and I'm a ceramicist. So I've done years of bronze. So I really, really appreciate your process and the time. And this time that we're living in is and it's beautiful work, and the symbols in it really hit home. So many of them. But this time is such a time of reflection. This year that we've all been we're coming out of, and everything has felt really slow for me too. But I feel like the world had to stop for a moment and hopefully it to wake up. But that time thing has really hit me, and my work does take a long time too, but I really feel you and hear you, and taking some time is good,
Yeah.
and it's important. But I can't wait to see what you will be doing. Really exciting work, and really beautifully crafted.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I don't talk a lot about it, but glasses and this like craft media history, just like ceramics, and there's this element of like it would be so much easier to make this out of another material, but
When you
there,
work in glass like you, or you guys, when you work in bronze, you make the thing like 7 times. It's like,
yeah.
it's really something. It's definitely a seasoned process. So,
Yeah, I think it's good for me though. Like it does slow me down, and I need to learn through epic failure. Like I really don't. I don't think unless I waste 100 hours on something, then I'll like learn a little bit of a little piece of information for the next one. Because I think the failure is important, but I do like appreciate there's a craft, like a lot of craftsmanship goes into it. And
yeah.
on the other hand, I love slapping some neon on like rocking horse I found in the garbage. That's like not well crafted.
It's exciting when it's a little bit faster. And I feel like how adaptive we artists, us artists, we really, it's our life. But this time has really even put us into like being even more adaptive, and the way that we're working, and the way maybe you're working in a different, but getting the 3D printer during the lockdown and stuff. And I just think I really am often in awe about artists. We keep, it's such a a tribe. It
Yeah,
can't-
I mean, I think it's like you find a way, right? I
Yeah.
when we first went into lockdown, uh, I very quickly knew this show I was gonna have in Detroit was canceled. And then like real quickly found out this residency was gonna be canceled. And I was like, I started out as a printmaker, so I had some like wood and I had carving tools. So I like tried to do some wood block stuff. And it was like helpful, I wasn't working and I had something to be creative, but it was like something was missing. Uh and I was like,
And
I
maybe,
knew I knew I wasn't gonna make something about like what was happening every day, but it was important to me to like have a creative outlet, especially once it was not my day job was shut down. So I was like, I can just doom scroll for 16 hours a day, or I can try to make some art. I gotta say, I'm glad I got the 3D printer, but I definitely bit off more than I expected to with that. I thought, hey, I get a printer and it prints stuff, and then oh yeah, I have to like learn all these digital modeling programs.
yeah.
And of course, by that point, I was back at my day job. We were allowed to be open again because it's like manufacturing, and I was like, man, I had all the time in the world 3 months ago to learn these programs and watch tutorials all day. I blew it.
They have ceramic 3D printers too,
Yeah. There's some people that have been doing some of these ceramic 3D printers and blowing glass into things that are ceramic 3D printed. Um, there is the MIT made a glass 3D printer, and they just look like really funny blobby vases. They're like very beautiful, but they like it's very impressive that they made it, but it's like
But 3D printers are so slow. So how would you like get the glass out in time?
it's like because the 3D printer does heat up filament and like squish it out of nozzle, right? So it becomes molten.
Yeah.
So the glass, like there's like a furnace with a plug that is like the nozzle at the bottom, and then a bed that moves around and like takes the direction. But I mean, they're beautiful objects, but it's like, all right, guys, you got like a lot of work to do before like you got first class 3D printer, but you got a lot of work to do before it's like printing anything other than some lumpy vases. The ceramic ones are already like
Yeah, they're moving.
pretty advanced.
James, you should look up the work of Bob Arneson. He's a San Francisco based, he's a pioneer in ceramics.
Oh, I know him. I mean, I don't know him personally, but I love his work. Yeah.
He's so irreverent. And I think that I was thinking about him with looking at your work.
Yeah. Yeah, I love his work. It's like just that humor, but like culturally, like, uh sort of like it's snarky, but it's like on point and beautifully made, yeah. Yeah, I'm a big fan.
Cool.
So just real quick, I know we're coming up on the end. Does anyone else want to ask James a question or have any comments?
I'll ask a quick question,
Okay.
which is, with all of your found objects, do you just have like a plethora of those, or do you find them and then get inspired?
I usually like find things that I'm very excited by, like the owl that I also use for like the Trump body. That's like actually that was an owl we bought to scare off squirrels from our garden that didn't work. But I was like, this is a pretty cool model thing, so usually I'll find stuff that I enjoy, and I just keep like a library of the molds. So I make molds of them usually pretty quickly if I know it's like a object I really wanted to use in some way. And then usually I clean them off, and some of them I've kept around, but a lot of times I just give them back to thrift stores. So I just put them back in like the thrift store cycle from whence they came. But every once in a while I find a thing that's like, I gotta go, like it really inspires the piece. Some of the pieces start with like they're coming from a specific viewpoint. I'm looking for the pieces to work with it to make the collage I want, and other pieces really do come out of an object. The Lincoln and Kennedy, heads that really like I found those objects like Lincoln came out of an old lamp factory on Front Street that is now like loft apartments or something, but there was a point when they were cleaning it out and they were like, come take a look. And Kennedy came out of that collection of slip cast molds, and both of those, like when I found them, I was like, all right, I gotta make a mold, gotta do a thing. And then I found Kennedy after I had the Lincoln. And when I found they were the same, like pretty close to the same size, that was when like, okay, like work using both of these and combining them like has to happen.
I'll keep you in mind if I ever find any good molds.
Yeah.
So are you in Fishtown?
Yeah, I'm in Fishtown.
I'm in Northern Liberties.
All right. Yeah, I found the divided ruling, the female figure, the blind justice. I found that rubber mold in the trash in Northern Liberties.
Yeah.
I was like going to dinner with my parents, and I was like, "Oh, hold on, sorry, Dad, I have to pick trash real quick." Well, my parents are very supportive, so
It's a good find.
yeah,
Mhm.
that was like one of the, I'm not usually actually trash picking. Yeah, it's usually thrift stores and stuff, but
Cool. Well, thank you so much, James, for being here tonight, and thanks to everyone for coming. I loved taking a deep dive into your work and the subject matter, and I really appreciate how eloquent you are about talking about your thought process. So thank you so much. This
yeah,
was
thank you for
awesome.
having me, and thanks. I know that was a lot of talking beforehand, but I appreciate everyone's time, and thanks again for having me.
Okay, good night.
Thank you, Angela. Thanks, Venture Cafe.